reframing, indeed, in my mind, is probably the single most important and impactful part of the art of decision analysis.
Hello, and welcome to the Decision Education Podcast, where I talk to experts and share tips on all things related to decision making. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Sweeney, broadcasting from the Alliance for Decision Education, the educational nonprofit committed to the belief that better decisions lead to better lives and a better society. Imagine what a difference it would make in your life and the lives of those you love if we were all even a little better at making decisions. This podcast is for you, the adults, who are already out in the world making thousands of decisions every day and who want to get better at it. My guest today is Eyas Raddad. Eyas is a research fellow at the Portfolio Strategy and Decision Science Group within Eli Lilly and Company. In 2017, he established and led the Research Decision Analytics function in Lilly Research Laboratories, with a mission that includes decision consulting and decision education for early research. He is also on the board at the Society of Decision Professionals. Among other topics in this episode, we talk about the critical importance of building the right frames for our decisions, the common attributes of the very best decision scientists in the field, why certain decision skills repeatedly get you invited on multiple work teams, and Eyas shares some good advice on how to avoid giving bad advice. I'm just going to start right off with the curiosity of mine, which is, how did your interest in this area in decision skills and decision analytics begin?
Honestly, it's something I practically stumbled upon, but I developed a passion for it that is really lifelong. I remember still the situation that got me to be exposed to decision analysis and decision quality when I was serving as a scientist on one of the many drug development teams at Lilly. And I was supporting that as a scientist, just like everyone else on the team. And I noticed the team really going into a whirlwind of discussions about trade-offs to make a certain decision, a go, no-go decision at the time, and how to structure it. And the trade-offs were known. In a sense, we know what the criteria were. It's just that we did not know how to balance them together to understand what makes a good drug versus not. So I went to consult with my decision science colleagues, Jay Anderson and Jim Felly at the time, who I still cherish my relationship with them as teachers and good friends. And they kind of just walked me through how I could structure such an opportunity and help the team come up with a more efficient way to come to that decision. And at that time, I was at awe that we can actually do this, even with the complexity that the team was going through. From that time on, I got more and more interested in it and got trained in decision consulting and did a stint in decision science to kind of refine my skill sets and practice. And ever since, I've been using these skill sets in every single situation and position that I have served.
Well, that's a great intro. And there's so much there to unpack. For a lot of our audience, the introduction to decision skills, decision analysis, all of this is completely new and outside of what they do in their day-to-day work. So I've got a bunch of questions here. The first is, what do you mean by decision analysis?
That's a great question, Joe. And honestly, sometimes I'm not sure it's the best way to refer to what we do as professionals. So to a large degree, I see decision analysts or decision scientists, I like to even use decision science, as experts who understand not only how to reduce complexity into structures. The structures become the way that you can organize information and knowledge, and is holistically important for the decision, and nothing more is needed to consider. In a sense, kind of defining the boundary between what is important to consider versus not, which is usually what really makes decisions very complicated. So that's one end. And the other end is trying to understand the biases that people come to the decisions with and protect the quality of the decision from those biases. Because those biases are most cases are not really intentional. They're kind of implicit biases that people have. It's honestly innate biologically, and perhaps have been very useful to us as a species evolutionarily. However, right now, they could very much derail the quality of decisions that we make. So, a decision analyst is someone who can protect the decision from the worst enemies of such decision, and then organize information so that decision makers are very much comfortable with the best course of action, even with the most complex and most anxiety provoking decisions in their organizations or their lives.
So I appreciate it. Let me see if I can say it back and if I got it right. So it sounds like you're saying whether you call the person a decision analyst or a decision scientist, one of the big values that they bring to a decision-making process is they help put boundaries around a decision to say what's in, what's out. That's one way of protecting the decision. Another way is to help identify and resist cognitive biases, which I'm going to ask you about in a second. And the last is to organize the information to structure the decision. Just going back for a second, one of the things you mentioned was this idea that there are biases. And for a lot of our listeners, the term bias usually comes up in their life when they're thinking about things around race or politics, equity issues, social justice. That's the kind of bias that's the way that term's often used. But it sounds like you're referring to something different, which I think you are. Could you talk about it more, what you mean?
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction because you're right. Actually, that reminds me of a time when I gave a lecture with a couple of colleagues on biases in decision making. And one of the questions was about racial bias and biases relating to diversity in general. So, although that one actually is a type of bias that definitely is at play in decision making, the biases that I'm referring to are many what I would call automatic thinking that does not even go to the frontal cortex, does not really become part of our conscious thinking. And our brain is trained to process them in a certain way for efficiency because our brain is trying to get to an estimate, if you will, very efficiently so that doesn't really overburden the frontal cortex. An example of those biases is what sometimes we call recency bias or availability bias. So, for example, if you're driving today and you saw an accident in front of you, and it was actually a horrifying accident, someone may have, got injured or something like that. For the rest of your drive, you're probably driving slower. You're driving more carefully. Well, what really changed about the risk of having an accident before you saw that event or you didn't? Probably nothing. The condition of the streets is still the same. The traffic level are probably still the same. It doesn't really justify a change in your behavior per se, unless your behavior before was quite reckless and you just got a reminder. But in general, if you're consciously thinking about it, the chance for you having an accident didn't change. But your brain plays a trick on you. When you see that accident, it actually, especially if it is something that provokes an emotion that is strong, it actually tells you this is important and you need to protect yourself. And thus, it can overestimate the chance of an accident and thus affect your decisions, how you drive, for example. This is a clear example of recency bias.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly clear one. Sometimes I find it's the translation or transferability from one domain of our life to another that's the most challenging about the subject area for people. So I thought that was a really good explanation and example of recency or availability bias. How would that maybe show up in the decision that you would help structure at work?
Great question. Actually, the reason I mentioned this specific bias is because I recently experienced it, not for myself, but with colleagues I'm working with. I received communication from leaders in a couple of functions that work in the research side of Lilly, the early discovery side. And they were responding to a question that came from senior leadership within the Lilly research organization. And the question was, are we having more than usual attrition in a certain therapeutic area and a specific phase? The reason that question was asked is that because there were two projects within a span of maybe 2 or 3 months that faced a kill decision. We call it kill decision for programs, meaning we stop basically activities, and that's based on data that may be suggestive the drug in development is not working or maybe more toxic than we had hoped for or something like that. So to me, I took it initially in saying, well, definitely we need to look at the data. However, there may be a recency bias here at play. So we looked at the data, and the data really was starkly, suggestive of no difference whatsoever between that therapeutic area attrition rates and any other therapeutic area, or even benchmarked against external data from other companies that we collected. So the answer quantitatively was no, we do not have any evidence that the attrition rate is different. I mean, there's always a possibility that the attrition rate is changing right now, and we're just seeing the initial inclinations of it. So the recommendation I gave as a decision scientist is, number one, be clear that we're not seeing something systemically alarming yet. However, we should look qualitatively at the stories of those projects that failed and start to understand what could be the reasons, and are these reasons avoidable in a sense? Can we do something that could improve the attrition rate generally? And that is always a good thing to do, right? I mean, you don't have to really wait for a disaster to happen. You can always really try to improve the chances of success of your projects.
I think it's a great point. We were talking with Ralph Keeney not too long ago, who's been focusing attention a lot on the idea of looking for opportunities to make decisions to improve your well-being or the outcomes at your organization, as opposed to waiting for decisions that feel like problems just to show up. So that's a nice tie-in and connection there. Can I go back for a second, though, to something else you said? You mentioned protecting the decision space or the organization from biases, also from what was in the decision versus what's not in the decision. I don't know if you remember talking about that.
Yeah.
What did you mean there, that there are things that you're trying to show the edge of or keep a boundary around?
Yeah, I mean, every situation that you're in, if you're trying to make a decision, basically you're saying, how should I allocate my resources, my time, my money, my relationship, etc., everything that you have a control over. As you think through all of that, you are actually making another decision, usually subconsciously, about how you're thinking about the situation, what you are focusing on versus things that are not materially important for this decision. This in my mind, I notice that the most when I try to counsel friends around their personal decisions. For example, let's say someone, just recently I was counseling as one of my mentees who just graduated or is graduating soon and looking for different opportunities to go, and actually different industries to go for. The first question she asked me, I want to decide how to handle one opportunity or one interview, if you will, for a sales job. I said, okay, I'm going to help you with that. But you know what? I'm not sure that's the right question to even ask. Maybe the right question was, based on my strengths, where my abilities could be the most likely to give me success in my career and satisfaction, what general industry should I be seeking? And within that industry, what kinds of roles should I be seeking? That question was not even asked, right? So I helped that individual reframe their mindset and focus on a different part of the space of possibilities of choices rather than the first one that was asked. So a decision scientist is usually skilled at hearing the question and kind of deconstructing the question to its basic fundamental needs that the decision maker has. And sometimes that needs some additional discovery, questioning, if you will. to understand really where the decision maker is coming from, and then focusing on really what fundamentally is important rather than what superficially seems important to the decision maker.
So I find this topic around reframing absolutely fascinating and really challenging intersection between what's intuition, what's wisdom of practice, and what's actually like craft or science, that a skill that we can actually develop. So, I remember a conversation once with a mentor. I think it was when I did my dissertation. He said, Joe, you can't even walk down a beach and pick up pebbles without a theory. You're always operating with a frame or the theory, because you're using some criteria to decide which pebbles to pick up and which ones not to. It's always happening. And every time that I help someone reframe a decision, I'm struck by how quickly a reframing occurs to the person who's on the outside of the problem. For you or for me, that we can come up with a different frame. But I'm curious about the place where I think my skill on that is low, is that I often stop at the first resonating reframing that I come up with. So a reframing that feels right to me. How do you experience reframing when you do it? Do you feel like there's a clear, better frame? Do you feel like there's like some nugget you're getting at? Do you generate a series of alternatives? Have you not really thought about it before? Like what's going on in your head when you try to reframe with someone or for yourself?
Yeah, reframing indeed, in my mind, just to kind of add to what you mentioned, is probably the single most important and impactful part of the art of decision analysis, or decision consulting, if you will, if you're adding something to like helping someone make better decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is a flaw in the frame, regardless of what else you do, is going to be definitely producing a low quality decision, because everything else maps to that frame. It had this space of alternatives you're choosing, how you measure goodness of an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else maps to that frame. So, and by the way, this part of a decision analyst training is probably what distinguishes the decision analyst or scientist the most from any other modeler or data scientist or something like that. People who are good with data, good with statistics, good with math, with programming that allows you to do the right calculations behind the scene, because it is really more of an art. It is less so than a science. It is more of an art. And it does take someone who is very skilled at listening and then reframing what they hear and play it back to the decision maker until they are sure that they are hearing the full scope of what is important, and then draw that line where that scope is, and again confirm that with decision maker. We typically do that in a listening session. We call it scoping session or framing session, where we just listen to the decision maker. We ask questions, a lot of questions, just to kind of probe our understanding first, and ask the question behind the question. If someone says, we need to reach the market really fast, for example, well, we ask the question, why is that important? And then you would say, well, it's obvious. If you reach the market sooner, that means we have a better ability to beat a competitor. Well, why is that important? Because if you beat the competitor, you might have a bigger market share. And why is that important? Because that's what gets you the most revenue. Well, then we uncovered that although speed seemingly was a decision criteria, it's really important only because it contributes to revenue. That's just an example of this series of questioning that we go through, which is really, to me, honestly, it's probably one of the most fulfilling to decision scientists and to decision makers. I would say something that is kind of funny. In my career, I noticed a lot of people come back and ask me questions and want me to be in teams. If you ask them why, they say a lot of things, but honestly, it's very difficult for them to kind of pinpoint. Very few people who recognize that the framing skill sets is really what distinguishes a good counsel when it comes to decision making.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. As you're talking about it, I was trying to sketch and take notes on what you're saying. And one of the sketches that came up for me was just someone gives you a frame, and sometimes you zoom up or zoom out. So you're abstracting the level, to get a different frame. Sometimes you're zooming in, getting more precise on the thing that they're trying to decide on. And sometimes you're just shifting sideways, horizontally on my little diagram here for other alternative framing. But I think that this idea that getting good at framing and reframing makes you such a valuable team member in your organization is something I'd like to figure out. How do we transfer that into what we look for in friends or, I guess, colleagues in our personal lives and in our non-work lives? Like, how do you get access to people who can really help you reframe, who can listen actively and do that? I don't know that we've got a lot of great guidance that I'm familiar with, at least, on how to be that kind of friend and how to solicit that kind of feedback from somebody. Have you come across anything that you'd recommend?
That's honestly, to me, this is why we have the Alliance of Decision Education and Society of Decision Professionals and other organizations and people who are passionate about improving decision skill sets. Framing is one of those fundamental skill sets, and I believe it's trainable. So anyone, regardless of where they're starting, they can certainly improve. And I firmly believe that we have nowhere near adequate number of such people in our societies to really drive everyone's lives to a better position and improve the lives of everyone. Because even one person in a circle of, let's say, 5 to 10 friends could make a huge difference on all of these families, if you will, that are dependent on them. We do not have enough. It's very obvious to me. I have noticed also that everyone, if you ask someone, let's say, for help in making a decision, they would actually just jump and help. And the way that they help is by talking to you about it. Oftentimes, if not most of the times, they might make you feel good, but not necessarily give you the best counsel for your decision. And there is a risk, actually, of helping someone if you are not, let's say, well able to help them frame their decision appropriately. And that's something most people do not realize and honestly jump their gun to helping, even when they could really, really be hurting potentially. So I guess the best way I can think of it is really to seek that knowledge, to help yourself and help others around you. Companies should also train their people to have enough critical mass of the employee base who are good decision makers and can help others make better decisions as well. So I really firmly believe in that mission.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm definitely going to ask you a question before we leave about the Alliance and what you would want to pass the next generation. But before we do, I'm curious about the decision makers that you know, whether at Lilly or in other professional circles, that you think of as, these are the ones that really set them apart. These are the best decision makers I know. What are the dispositions or the skills that you see or behaviors that you see in them that puts them in that category for you, besides framing, since we've talked about framing quite a bit?
Actually, a good decision maker does not even need to be a good framer or even to be a good analyst of decisions, as long as they recognize what they need to make a good decision. And so for a decision maker, I believe the first thing that sets good ones apart from the bad ones is their temperament, especially with regard to impulse control. Impulsive decisions, emotion-driven decisions is usually how the bad decision making just comes by. And thus, people who are more patient would definitely allows them the time needed to make those decisions. Now, the other obviously important thing is that decision makers can distinguish between an important decision that is really consequential and requires a more deep thought and analysis versus one that we shouldn't really spend too much time on, and thus base those kind of decisions on some heuristics or quick thought that generates a decision and we just move forward. So being able to distinguish these kinds of decisions is definitely critical. And then a few other, I guess, skill sets and tendencies that I believe are important for a decision maker, like recognizing missing angles. So this does not mean that they already know what the frame needs to be, but at least they have not heard something about an angle that they believe could be important, and thus
What do you,
demanding
sorry, what do you
such
mean by
information.
angle? I'm not following you there.
An angle, let's say, an angle in a decision is basically a consideration that has not been talked about, has not
Oh,
been
okay.
considered yet,
Okay.
right? And that these skill sets that I'm talking about requires patience, requires, not shooting from the hip, and requires humility, being able to listen to others and wait before exercising your judgment and talking about what you think. Because once you do, as a leader especially, that really changes the dynamics. I've seen it time and time again where very important people in the organization, when they are in the vicinity of a higher level leader, end up actually just saying, yes, I agree with him or her, rather than speaking their minds. And thus, allowing people to speak their mind before you interject is important so that you can ensure that this decision space is adequately explored. And that takes, honestly, an inclusive and safe environment for discussion and deliberation to be there for you to be able to avoid blind spots.
I was just reading Annie Duke's new book, How to Decide. I don't know if you've seen that one yet. It just came out. And she talks about decision hygiene. And one of the big things in there is protecting other people's opinion from getting anchored by your opinion or by the way you ask your questions. Like, you would never want to say to somebody, I think so-and-so is a real idiot. What do you think of them? Like that would, clearly bias what they're going to respond with. I know you've got kids coming home soon and that our time is running down. So I'm going to focus on kids for a second. And most people who are listening to this know about the Alliance for Decision Education and that we're trying to empower the next generation of decision makers with these essential decision skills. But what I'm curious about is if we were successful, if we were able to bring the kinds of thinking, dispositions, skills to young people that you've been talking about during this conversation, if we're able to do that, what do you think would look different in our society right now? Sometimes I ask people to think about the future, but actually I think, with whether it's an election going on or it's a global pandemic or it's questions about the climate, it's questions about the way that society is operating, however you want to think about it, I think now is actually a pretty interesting time to examine. What do you think would be different? What would you imagine would be different if we were able to teach all young people decision skills?
Wow, this is a huge question, honestly, Joe. And it is really at the core of why I am passionate about decision making, the quality of decision making, and training people for it. Because I really believe that practically every single problem that anyone can think of, whether it is personal, organizational, local, or national, or even global, there is a fundamental decision making involved in it. And thus, if we make those decisions well, we certainly will be better as a person, as a family, as a society, as the globe as well. So, and this is for me very clearly reflected in how I parent my kids. I really try to train them very early in their lives to make decisions. So when we go to, for example, purchase a toy, I give them the constraint so that I force them to make decisions that are normal, natural in their adult life eventually. So tell them, all right, you have this budget, for example, or maybe that's the money that they earned, and tell them, all right, choose a toy. And as they are looking around, I ask them questions like, what makes you like this one? And they tell me a little more about what they're viewing. And then they start comparing the cost and what the experience that they're getting from different toys. So I want them to develop those skill sets. For me, a skill set that is developed at 6 years old in choosing a game is the same skill that my teenager is going to need when he's faced with the marijuana joint or the, basically the request from a friend to go to a place that he knows he shouldn't be, or to drive safely or not. It's exactly the same skill set. And if you expand that to organizations or families, it's the same thing. If families make good choices for their kids, that means, and for the family as a whole, that means the children are being nurtured in a more positive place. And if that is the case, they're going to be more economically sound. They're going to be more well in their life. They will be better, in their health and their mental health and wellness. Just imagine any societal problem that we have right now and tell me which one is not affected by better citizens and better families and better governments. Now, the other thing I want to add here is how, and this is basically a reflection on the partisan, hyper-partisan, and divided society that we have here in the United States, and actually even globally. And basically, it's quite obvious to me that having a way for us to process important decisions and understand the different value metrics and try to come up with an appropriate balance of the different value metrics could really be a venue or a way for us to process difficult societal choices, like how we deal with global warming, how we deal with the divide between urban and rural area and distribution of resources, how we deal with a division of economics, between the wealthy and the poor, etc. Everything has a solution. It just takes people to really understand the problem from a single frame rather than extremely different frames that never are able to talk to each other.
So I know we're going to run out of time, and if you got to go, you got to go. But I'm wondering about the difference, though, between someone searching for a frame when it's one person and they have a relatively known or at least consistent set of values, if you keep exploring, versus an organization where they may not all share the same values as different stakeholders, but they have a similar value proposition with regard to the decisions the company's making with regard to profit maximization or stakeholder return. When you're talking about, shareholder return, when you're talking about decisions in society, you have people who are not only in different situations and different values, but they get different benefits and risks when decisions go one way or the other. They don't share equally in the outcomes of the decision. So are you thinking that there are additional things that we would need? Let me frame it differently. Let's say that we took several of your colleagues who were decision scientists and we had them approach a political question. Because they're skilled in this, would that make it easier to get to a shared solution? Or is the nature of that zero-sum game where people are trying to get theirs, is that going to pull them apart anyway? Would we get back to partisan issues?
Everything I will say is purely a hypothesis because
Sure.
I don't think anyone had tried that yet, or at least I've seen actually one example. I believe Frank Koch and it was Carl Spetzler had spoke about an instance when there was a decision to be made at the local level, and there were environmental, governmental, and general population interests that were not aligned per se, in a sense, different value metrics. And they actually conducted on a situation, I believe it was something related to wind turbine or something like that, and what to do with them, like old decommissioned ones. And eventually, really the analysis helped everyone come together, feel recognized that their value system is part of the decision problem. And secondly, understand that advancing their value metrics could come at the expense of other value metrics. So they understand that there is a tension, there's a trade-off. But now we're talking about the important thing rather than kind of shifting the problem to something else that has nothing to do with it, just because that might get you to win the argument.
Right.
Reframing that politicians are so good at, right? I mean, spin doctors, basically, that really they just want to say what is useful to them. And I think that is what is needed in society right now, is to avoid that spinning and going down to the fundamentals. Understand that these social issues of immigration, economic justice, etc., are difficult, complex issues that have many facets to them. And there's no decision that will be clear, if you will, here. It's all about trade-offs. The question is, what is the right trade-off? I wish, for example, we actually not just ask people to vote for people in elections, but ask them to vote for trade-off levels that would be appropriate, because it's innate in every single decision. You know, for example, the COVID situation here, the implicit, unspoken of trade-off was the economic growth number, and obviously, or contraction, relative to some degree, the lives potentially lost in this.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than understanding that trade-off, unfortunately, is there and we cannot resolve it. I mean, to some degree, we can with some precautions, but it's not ever going to go down to zero. You know that if you open up the economy, even with precautions, there will be more deaths. The question is, what is acceptable? And rather than saying those words, one politician would tell you you're risking everyone's life, and the other politician is telling you you are depriving people from their basic necessities and economic viability. Well, both are correct in some way, but they're not really talking about the real issue, is the trade-off here.
So trade-offs is a topic that you mentioned earlier that I wanted to go into. Also wanted to get into how we structure decisions. So I think that what you do with structuring decisions is fascinating. There's this whole thing of once you have a frame and you're gathering information and how those two feed into each other, but also then how you determine which information that you're gathering is credible, reliable, significant, etc. There's just so much here, but we're out of time for this conversation, but this was a delight and a learning experience for me as well as our audience. I just want to say thank you. And is there any last tip or trick or book that you want to mention to people if you could get the word out? Hey, go pay attention to this. Does anything come to mind?
Well, certainly, honestly, what I would leave everyone is start the journey of improving your decision skill sets, and the returns are going to be immense, actually rather quickly. For me, some of the books that really made the most impact on me were some of Ralph Keeney's books, including Smart Choices. That book is really written in such a simple way that anyone can fully understand it and benefit from it. So start somewhere. It doesn't matter. There's so many other books I could start and probably not end here that really helps people understand what a quality decision looks like. And Joe, I really want to thank you and the Alliance for taking on this immense mission that is honestly so monumental to the level that it was maybe overwhelming to many people. And you just took that challenge head on. I do believe that your work will make amazing difference for people. And I am fully supportive of that. And I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts and be on your journey and helpful in any way that I can.
Well, thank you very much for that. That quote that you maybe didn't even mean to give about starting the journey, we're definitely going to be plastering that everywhere. I'm sorry, but that just became the takeaway. But thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it. Love to have you back sometime.
I would love to be back as well. Thank you very much, Joe.
A huge thank you to Eyas. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope you found it valuable. At the Alliance for Decision Education, our mission is to improve lives by empowering students with essential decision skills. We are building a national movement to ensure decision education is part of every student's learning experience. Through this podcast, we are raising awareness about the movement, But we need your help. Please share, tweet, and sign the petition on our website, alliancefordecisioneducation.org. If there is someone you think would be great for us to interview for a future episode, or if you have a question about decision making that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, email us at connect@alliancefordecisioneducation.org. Also, ratings on Apple Podcasts are greatly appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe to this podcast in your favorite app so that you don't miss an episode. Thank you, and I hope you join us again soon.